You think you're middle class, but you're not, and that's costing you money. Your dollar buys less today than it did last year. A lot less. That grocery bill that used to be $120, now it's $150 for the same stuff. Let me guess, your rent went up again. Now gas costs more. In fact, it seems like everything costs more. But here's what nobody's telling you. This isn't just bad luck or corporate greed. The U.S. government's $34.8 trillion debt is directly making you poorer through a hidden tax you never voted for, inflation. Stick around, because it's time to learn how money works and why your government's debt problem becomes your wallet problem.
So, what is the U.S. debt, and why should you care? The U.S. national debt currently sits at $34.8 trillion. That's a number so big, it's hard to wrap your head around. So let's break it down. There are about 333 million Americans. That means every single person in this country, babies, retirees, everyone, owes $104,000 in government debt. Your family of four? That's $416,000 of debt hanging over your heads. Now, this isn't like your credit card debt where you can just pay it off. This is exactly the same as asking how the government borrows money in the first place. When the government needs cash, they sell bonds. Think of bonds as IOUs. You give the government $1,000, they promise to pay you back $1,100 in 10 years. The extra $100 is interest, your reward for lending them money. But here's the problem. The government keeps needing more money because they spend way more than they earn. This fiscal year, the government brought in $3.3 trillion in taxes. Sounds like a lot, right? But they spent $4.5 trillion. That's a $1.2 trillion deficit, meaning they had to borrow $1.2 trillion just to keep the lights on. This is exactly the same as spending $4,500 every month when you only earn $3,300. You'd have to put $1,200 on credit cards just to survive. And next month, you'd have to borrow even more because now you have credit card payments on top of everything else. That's what's happening to America right now. The scariest part? Interest payments on this debt now eat up 13% of the entire federal budget. That's $601 billion this year just in interest, not paying down the actual debt, just interest. To put that in perspective, the government spends more on interest payments than on education, transportation, and veterans benefits combined. And those interest payments are growing fast. Here's why this matters to your wallet. When the government needs to pay these massive interest bills, they have three options: raise taxes, cut spending, or borrow more money. Raising taxes means less money in your paycheck. Cutting spending means fewer government services. But the third option, borrowing more money, that's where it gets sneaky. Because when the government borrows more money to pay their debts, they're not just pushing the problem down the road, they're making your money worth less through inflation. Think about it. If the government keeps creating new money to pay their debts, there are more dollars chasing the same amount of stuff. More dollars, same amount of houses, cars, and groceries. What happens to prices? They go up. The Congressional Budget Office, the government's own accounting department, says this problem is only getting worse. They project the deficit will grow from $2 trillion in 2024 to $2.8 trillion by 2034. That's not a typo. The hole gets deeper every year. And here's the kicker. The solutions are all politically unpopular. Nobody wants higher taxes. Nobody wants cuts to Social Security or Medicare. Nobody wants to reduce military spending. So, what's the government's secret weapon? Let inflation slowly eat away at the debt and your purchasing power along with it. But here's where it gets personal for your money.
Inflation is the government's secret debt payment method. And it's brilliant because most people don't even realize it's happening. Here's how this hidden tax works. When the government can't pay their bills with taxes alone, they get the Federal Reserve to create new money out of thin air. The Fed then uses this brand new money to buy government bonds. Boom! The government just got cash to spend without raising your taxes. But that new money doesn't just disappear into the economy without consequences. It dilutes every dollar you own. Let me show you how powerful this is with a simple example from the 1970s. In 1970, the median house price in America was $24,000. The average full-time salary was $7,700. A loaf of bread cost 24 cents. Now imagine you bought that house in 1970 with a $24,000 mortgage. Fast forward to today, that same house is worth $428,000. Your salary would be around $60,000, and that loaf of bread, it's $2.50. What happened? Inflation. The government slowly inflated away the value of that $24,000 mortgage. Today, $24,000 feels like pocket change because all the new money created over 50 years made each individual dollar worth less. This is exactly what the government is doing with their debt right now, just faster. When the Federal Reserve creates new money to buy government bonds, they're essentially printing money to pay the government's bills. More money enters the economy, but the same amount of goods and services exist. Result: prices rise across the board. The Federal Reserve actually targets 2% inflation every year. They don't want zero inflation. They want steady, constant inflation. Why? Because 2% inflation means the government's debt burden shrinks by 2% every year in real terms. Think about it. If the government owes $34.8 trillion today and inflation runs at 2% for 10 years, that debt becomes worth about $28.5 trillion in today's purchasing power. The government literally inflated away $6.3 trillion of their debt burden. But here's the catch. Your savings and wages get inflated away too. That $10,000 in your savings account, with 2% inflation, it only buys $8,200 worth of stuff in 10 years. Your salary might go up, but it typically lags behind the real cost of living increases. We saw this strategy on steroids during the recent inflation surge. From 2020 to 2022, the government created massive amounts of new money through pandemic spending programs. The Federal Reserve bought trillions in government bonds to fund this spending. What happened next? Inflation hit 9.1%, the highest in 40 years. Your grocery bill exploded, gas prices doubled, rent went through the roof, used cars became luxury items. Everything got more expensive fast. This wasn't an accident or just supply chain issues. This was the direct result of creating too much new money too quickly. The government funded their massive spending spree by diluting your purchasing power. The cruel irony is that while your groceries cost 20% more and your rent went up 15%, the government's debt burden got lighter. They borrowed trillions at near zero interest rates, then inflated away the real value of those debts. Meanwhile, your fixed salary couldn't keep up with rising costs. Your savings lost value, your standard of living declined, while the government's debt problem got easier to manage. This is why inflation is called a hidden tax. You never get a bill in the mail, but you pay it every time you buy anything. The government gets to spend money they don't have, and you get to pay for it through higher prices. The Federal Reserve tries to keep this tax at a manageable 2% per year. But as we've seen recently, when they need to fund massive government spending, that rate can spike much higher. And here's the thing, they can't just stop. The debt keeps growing, which means they need to keep creating new money to manage it. That means inflation isn't going away. It's a permanent feature of how the government manages their debt crisis. This affects different parts of your financial life differently.
Let's get specific about how this debt crisis is draining your bank account every single month. Your housing costs are the biggest hit. If you're renting, you've watched your monthly payment climb relentlessly. The average rent in America has jumped 30% since 2020. That's not landlord greed. That's inflation from all the new money creation hitting the housing market. If you're trying to buy a house, you're getting hammered twice. First, home prices shot up because all that newly created money flooded into real estate. Second, mortgage rates doubled from 3% to over 7% as the Federal Reserve tried to cool down the inflation they helped create. So now you need a $120,000 household income to afford what required an $80,000 income just 3 years ago. The government's debt spending pushed home ownership further out of reach for millions of Americans. Your grocery bill tells the same story. Food prices are up 25% since 2020. That family dinner that cost $15 to make now costs $19. Your weekly grocery run went from $120 to $150 for the exact same items. This isn't corporate price gouging. This is what happens when you inject trillions of new dollars into the economy while food production stays roughly the same. More money Chasing the same amount of food equals higher food prices. Transportation costs hit you multiple ways. Gas prices spiked because energy markets react quickly to currency debasement. Used car prices went insane, up 40% in some areas, because the auto industry couldn't increase production fast enough to match all the new money floating around. Even if you don't drive much, everything you buy got more expensive to transport. Those higher shipping costs get passed directly to you through higher prices on everything, from clothes to electronics. This is called wage lag, and it's why you feel poorer even if you got a raise. Your boss might have given you a 4% increase this year, but if inflation is running at 6%, you actually took a 2% pay cut in purchasing power. Most employers adjust wages slowly and reluctantly. They look at last year's inflation numbers when deciding this year's raises. Meanwhile, you're paying this year's inflated prices with last year's salary adjustments. The math is brutal. If inflation runs 5% higher than your wage growth for just 2 years, your standard of living drops 10%. You're working the same hours for less real money. Your savings account is getting destroyed too. Let's say you have $20,000 saved up earning 1% interest in a traditional savings account. With inflation running at 6%, your savings are losing 5% of their purchasing power every year. That $20,000 can only buy $19,000 worth of stuff after 1 year. After 5 years of this, your $20,000 savings can only buy about $15,400 worth of goods and services. Your money is evaporating while sitting in the bank. Credit cards and loans are crushing people right now. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates to fight the inflation they helped create. Your credit card rate went from 18% to 24%. Your car loan rate doubled. Personal loans became prohibitively expensive. So you're paying more for everything due to inflation, earning less in real terms due to wage lag, and borrowing money costs way more when you need it. This is the inflation tax in action. The government gets to pay off their debts with cheaper dollars, while you get stuck paying more for everything with dollars that buy less. Now here's the cruelest part. Your paycheck isn't keeping up.
Let's talk about protecting your money in a high-debt world. You can't control the government's debt spiral, but you can protect yourself from its effects. Here are the strategies that actually work when your currency is being systematically devalued. First, understand the difference between nominal returns and real returns. Your savings account might pay 2% interest, but if inflation is running at 5%, you're losing 3% of your purchasing power every year. That's a real return of negative 3%. This is why high-yield savings accounts became crucial during the recent rate hikes. When the Federal Reserve raised rates to fight inflation, some banks started offering 4 to 5% on savings accounts. If you can find a savings account paying 5% while inflation runs at 4%, you're actually gaining purchasing power. But don't expect this to last. Once the Fed starts cutting rates again to help the government manage their debt payments, those high-yield rates will disappear fast. Take advantage while you can. Fixed-rate debt becomes your friend in an inflationary environment. If you have a 30-year mortgage at 3%, you're essentially borrowing money that gets cheaper to pay back every year inflation runs above 3%. This is exactly what the government does with their debt, and you can use the same strategy. That $300,000 mortgage payment stays the same while your wages rise with inflation. In 10 years, that payment feels much smaller relative to your income. The key is locking in fixed rates before they rise further. Variable rate loans, credit cards, adjustable mortgages, home equity lines of credit become dangerous when rates are climbing. They'll eat up more of your budget as rates rise. Your emergency fund needs serious attention right now. The old rule was 3 to 6 months of expenses, but when costs are rising unpredictably, you need more cushion. Calculate your emergency fund based on today's inflated costs, not last year's budget. If your monthly expenses jump from $4,000 to $5,200, your 6-month emergency fund needs to be $31,200, not $24,000. Build this fund in those high-yield savings accounts while rates are elevated.
Yes, you might lose some purchasing power to inflation, but liquidity matters more than perfect inflation protection for emergency money. Here's something most people miss. You need to track your personal inflation rate, not the government's numbers. The official inflation rate averages everyone's spending, but your costs might be rising faster or slower. If you rent in a hot market, drive a lot, or have kids in daycare, your personal inflation rate is probably much higher than the official numbers. Track your actual expenses monthly and budget based on your reality, not government statistics. When it comes to any investments, focus on understanding real returns versus nominal returns. A stock that goes up 8% in a year sounds great, but if inflation ran 6%, your real return was only 2%. This applies to everything, your 401k, any bonds you own, even your home's value. Always subtract the inflation rate from your returns to see if you're actually getting ahead or just keeping up. Budgeting becomes critical when costs rise unpredictably. You can't just set a budget in January and forget about it. Review and adjust quarterly because your grocery budget from 6 months ago might be completely unrealistic today. Focus on the categories hit hardest by inflation: housing, food, transportation, and energy. These are where the government's monetary policy hits your wallet first and hardest. The most important skill you can develop is financial literacy itself. Understanding how money works, how inflation transfers wealth from savers to debtors, and how government policy affects your purchasing power, this knowledge becomes more valuable every year. The U.S. national debt creates inflation that steadily reduces your purchasing power. That's the hidden tax you never voted for, but pay every day. Understanding this connection helps you make better money decisions in a world where your government's debt problem becomes your wallet problem. When you know the game, you can at least play defense. If you want more straightforward breakdowns of how money works, hit that subscribe button.